My daughter had been planning this engagement party for 6 months, and everything looked perfect. The backyard of our property in Kelowna was strung with lights. 60 guests were laughing and raising glasses, and my son-in-law-to-be was standing at the center of it all, arm around my daughter's waist, smiling like a man who had already won. That was when my daughter slipped away from him for just a moment, came to where I was standing near the garden wall, squeezed my forearm, and whispered 4 words that made the wine in my hand feel suddenly very heavy. "Dad, check his references." Then she walked back to him, smiled at a neighbor who was congratulating them, and acted as though nothing had happened. I kept my face completely still. 41 years in commercial real estate will teach you that much at least. My name is Robert Gallagher. I'm 64 years old, semi-retired, and I live on the property my late wife Patricia and I built together over the better part of 3 decades in the Okanagan. Patricia passed away 4 years ago from a cancer that moved faster than any of us were prepared for. Before she died, she made me promise 2 things. The first was that I would stop working 7 days a week. The second was that I would look after our daughter, Megan, not in the way that keeps a grown woman small. She was clear about that. She meant the other kind of looking after, the kind where you pay attention, where you stay awake. I had not always done a good job of that second promise, but I was trying. Megan was 31 when she met Thomas Hale at a fundraising dinner in Vancouver. She had moved there 8 years earlier for work, built a career in healthcare administration, and had been careful with her heart in the way that people are after 1 or 2 relationships that ended badly. She called me 2 days after that dinner, and I could hear something different in her voice. Not just excitement, something softer than excitement. He was 40, she told me, a financial consultant who specialized in estate planning for high-net-worth families. He had grown up in Halifax, moved west for university, built his practice over 15 years. He was calm, she said, measured. He asked good questions and listened to the answers. He made her feel, and she paused here looking for the right word, seen. I was glad for her. I was. The first time I met Thomas was at a dinner she organized at a restaurant in Kelowna, about 3 months into their relationship. He drove up from Vancouver specifically for it. He was tall, well-dressed without being flashy, and he had the particular quality that very skilled people in sales develop over years of practice, the ability to make whoever they are talking to feel like the most important person in the room. He asked about my career with what seemed like genuine interest. He knew enough about commercial real estate to ask intelligent questions. He was attentive to Megan in a way that looked entirely natural. I drove home that night and sat in Patricia's old reading chair for a long time. Something felt like a performance. I couldn't explain it better than that. Nothing he said was wrong. Nothing he did was wrong. But there was a quality to his attention that reminded me of someone doing a very good impression of a real person rather than actually being one. Patricia would have told me I was being impossible. Maybe she would have been right. I kept the feeling to myself. They dated for 14 months before he proposed. He did it at the restaurant in Vancouver where they'd had their first proper date. She called me from the parking lot afterward, still crying happy tears, and I told her I was thrilled for her. I was not entirely lying. I wanted very much to be thrilled. The engagement party in Kelowna was 6 weeks later. Megan had organized most of it herself, with help from her closest friend, Diane, who had driven down from Kamloops for the weekend. Thomas arrived the evening before with what seemed like half a wardrobe, settled into the guest room, and spent the morning before the party taking calls in the back garden that he ended quickly whenever I came near. I told myself that was normal. Consultants take calls on weekends. That is simply the life. Then Megan said what she said at the party, and I understood that she had not said it on impulse. She had been waiting for a moment when she could say it without being overheard. She had chosen her words carefully. 4 words, not 10. Enough to tell me something was wrong, not enough to cause a scene if someone had been watching. My daughter is not a woman who panics. She had been carrying something, and she had chosen me to carry it with her. I stayed at the party for another 40 minutes. I laughed at the right moments, refilled my glass once, and spoke with Thomas for nearly 10 minutes about the Okanagan wine industry. He was charming and relaxed. I watched his eyes while he talked. They were busy in a way his face was not. After the last guests left and Megan and Diane were cleaning up in the kitchen, I told everyone I was tired and went to bed. I did not sleep. I opened my laptop. I am not a man who uses the internet particularly well. My assistant at the firm spent years gently redirecting me away from search engines and toward phone calls, which I am much better at. But I knew enough to start somewhere. I typed in Thomas Hale, Financial Consultant, Halifax, and spent an hour reading. His professional website was clean and credible. LinkedIn showed a steady career history. There were a couple of mentions in industry publications. Nothing remarkable. His face appeared in a group photograph from a charity golf tournament in Vancouver 3 years earlier. Everything looked exactly as it should look. That was, in a strange way, what bothered me. The next morning I called Megan before Thomas was awake. She came outside to the garden, and I asked her directly. She had been going through his laptop, she told me. Not out of suspicion at first, but because hers had been charging in their bedroom, and she needed to look something up quickly. She had opened a browser tab that he had not closed. It was a spreadsheet. At the top of the column, she had time to read before she heard him coming down the hallway. She saw Megan Gallagher, Kelowna property, estate value, and then a number she recognized as a rough approximation of what she believed my estate to be worth. She closed the laptop before he reached the room. She said nothing. She had spent 3 weeks trying to convince herself there was an innocent explanation. I told her she had done the right thing by telling me. I told her to act normal. I told her I would handle it. She looked at me the way she used to look at me when she was 9 years old and had fallen off her bicycle and was trying very hard not to cry. I held that look together as long as I needed to, and then I went inside and called my lawyer. Helen Marsh had handled our family's legal work for 18 years. I'd first hired her when Patricia and I were restructuring the property holdings, and she was the person who helped me set up the family trust after Patricia died. Not enormous by the standards of some, but the Gallagher family trust represented the accumulated work of 4 decades. The Kelowna property, 2 commercial buildings in Penticton, and a portfolio of investments Patricia had managed with extraordinary patience. Megan was the primary beneficiary. Helen, I said, if someone were to marry Megan and she then added them to the trust as a co-trustee or named beneficiary, how quickly could assets be moved? She was quiet for a moment. Depending on the structure and the signing authority, she said, it could happen in a matter of days. If they had the right documentation and access to the financial institutions, possibly faster. What would they need? A marriage certificate, her signature and the co-trustee signature on the modification paperwork, and access to the account numbers, which would be in the trust documents themselves. I thanked her and told her I might need to call again soon. Then I called a man named Gary Sinclair. I had met Gary 15 years earlier when he was conducting background checks for a large commercial transaction I was involved in. He had since built a small but highly regarded private investigation practice in the Lower Mainland. He was methodical, discreet, and he did not speculate. He told you what he found, and nothing more, which is the only kind of person worth hiring for a job like that. I told Gary I needed a complete background check on Thomas Hale, 40 years old, financial consultant, Vancouver. I gave him the details Megan had shared with me over 14 months. I did not tell him why yet. I asked how long it would take. 3 days for the surface work, he said. A week for anything deeper. I said I needed it in 5 days. He said he would see what he could do. Those 5 days were among the more difficult I have spent. Thomas stayed in Kelowna for 2 more days after the party. Helpful and easy to have around, and I sat across the dinner table from him each evening and talked about wine and property values and the particular challenges of the Coquihalla in winter. He was very good at dinner table conversation. I found myself almost liking him, which made everything feel worse. He drove back to Vancouver on a Tuesday. Megan stayed an extra day. I told her what little I knew, which was not much yet, and told her again to act normally. She was frightened. I could see that, but she was also angry in a way that gave her steadiness. Patricia had been the same. When they were frightened and angry simultaneously, the women in my family became very, very calm. Gary called on the 5th day. The real name was not Thomas Hale. It was Trevor Halliday, born in Moncton, New Brunswick, 41 years ago. The Halifax background was partly true. He had lived there, but the career history Gary's sources uncovered was substantially different from the one on his LinkedIn profile. There was a civil lawsuit in Nova Scotia from 7 years ago. A former business partner who had alleged that Trevor Halliday had misrepresented financial documents in order to gain access to a joint account and had then liquidated it. The case had been settled out of court. The amounts were sealed, but the documentation existed. There was also a marriage, Trevor Halliday had been married to a woman in Fredericton, divorced after 22 months. Her father, Gary, had found through property records, owned a substantial commercial property portfolio in New Brunswick. The divorce settlement had included a payment to Trevor that had come, according to a source Gary would not name but said was reliable, from the father-in-law, who had simply wanted the situation to end quietly. And there was a third name on Gary's list, a woman in Calgary. Her name was Renata Voss. According to what Gary had found, she was 44 years old, and she and Trevor Halliday shared a numbered company registered in Alberta. The company had no visible business activity, but money had moved through it. Gary had the transfer records. I sat in my office with the phone against my ear and looked out at the vineyard that ran along the south side of the property. "Gary," I said, "is this man planning to marry my daughter, to access her inheritance?" "I think," Gary said carefully, "that someone has done something very similar before, and that the structure is similar enough to warrant serious concern." I asked him to keep digging. I asked specifically about Renata Voss. I asked whether there were any other connections to the family trust specifically, whether anyone had been making inquiries. He said he would call me back. He called back the following evening. Renata Voss had worked for 3 years as a paralegal at an estate planning law firm in Calgary. She had left that firm under circumstances Gary described as unclear, but noted that she had departed without a reference, and without the partnership track she had apparently been promised. She now worked, on paper, as a freelance legal consultant. Her actual income, based on what Gary had been able to trace, appeared to come primarily from the numbered company she shared with Trevor. More importantly, Gary had found emails. He did not explain in detail how, and I did not ask, but Trevor had used a personal email account that had not been sufficiently secured, and Gary had a source who had accessed a portion of the correspondence. In those emails, Trevor referred to Megan by her first name and to the Gallagher estate by a shorthand that Gary would not repeat on the phone, but which made the nature of the plan clear. Renata had been advising him on the trust modification process. She knew exactly which documents would need to be signed, and in what order to give Trevor access before any legal challenge could be mounted. They were planning to move within 30 days of the wedding. I closed my eyes and thought about Patricia. I thought about the 31 years she had spent helping me build everything that was now sitting in the crosshairs of 2 people who had done this, or something very like it, at least once before. Then I started planning. Megan's wedding was 8 weeks away. The venue was a winery property outside Naramata that she had booked nearly a year in advance. 110 guests. The rehearsal dinner was the night before at a boutique hotel in Penticton, 40 guests, immediate family, and the wedding party. I called Helen Marsh again. I told her what Gary had found. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said things I will not repeat in full, because she is a composed professional, and she was not composed. When she was finished, she told me that she could work with the RCMP's Financial Crimes Unit, that she had a contact there, and that the documentation Gary had assembled was likely sufficient to open a formal investigation. But she also told me that the most durable outcome, the one that would be hardest to challenge later, would be if Trevor was caught in the act of attempting the fraud, rather than simply being accused of planning it. I told her to make the call to the RCMP contact. I told her I would handle the rest. There is a particular kind of patience that you develop in 40 years of negotiating commercial real estate transactions. You learn that the person who speaks first, when the silence becomes uncomfortable, has already given something away. You learn that the moment you show your hand is almost never the right moment. You learn to wait. I called Megan and told her everything, all of it. She sat on the other end of the phone without speaking for a long time, and then she said, in a voice that was entirely steady, "What do you need me to do?" "That is my daughter." I needed her to do nothing differently, to keep planning the wedding, to respond to Trevor's messages the way she always had, to give no indication that anything had changed. It was a great deal to ask of someone who had just been told that the man she was going to marry had likely been cataloging her inheritance since their 3rd date. She did not hesitate. Gary had found that Renata Voss would be in Penticton the weekend of the rehearsal dinner. She was registered at the same boutique hotel under her own name, listed on the hotel booking as a wedding guest. She was not on Megan's guest list. Trevor had added her under the cover of the wedding planner's external vendor coordination, claiming she was a legal consultant reviewing the venue contract. She was not reviewing any venue contract. I arrived at the Penticton Hotel the morning of the rehearsal dinner, checked in, and met Gary in the lobby cafe. He handed me an envelope. Inside was a printed summary of everything he had found, signed and dated, along with a USB drive containing the documentary evidence. He also handed me a small digital recorder, the kind that fits in a jacket pocket and runs for 6 hours on a single charge. The rehearsal dinner started at 7. The hotel's private dining room overlooked Skaha Lake, and in the early September evening the water was flat and copper-colored in the last of the light. Trevor was in excellent form. He made a toast to Megan that was genuinely moving. Her brother, my son Daniel, who had driven down from Kamloops, leaned over to me at one point and said, quietly, "I think I misjudged him." I told Daniel I hoped he was right. At 8:45, I watched Trevor excuse himself, saying he needed to make a quick call. He walked toward the hotel corridor that led to the elevator bank. I gave it 4 minutes, then excused myself with an apology about my back, which is in fact not good, and walked the same corridor. Gary had confirmed Renata Voss was in room 214. I took the elevator to the second floor. The hallway was quiet. I walked slowly, the recorder already running in my jacket pocket, and when I reached the area outside room 214 I could hear, clearly enough, 2 voices. Renata's was the sharper one. She was going through a checklist, the trust modification form, she said, the one that your lawyer reviewed. And by your lawyer she clearly did not mean any lawyer of Trevor's I had met. I need his signature on page 4 and Megan's on page 7. If you can get both of those before midnight on Friday, I can have the transfer request submitted by opening of business Monday. The banks won't flag it as unusual if it comes through the trust account with both signatures on file. Trevor's voice. And the property transfers? Those take longer, Renata said. But they don't matter. The liquid assets in the investment account alone are worth more than enough. We'll be well clear before anyone realizes the transfer wasn't a routine distribution. What about the old man? He doesn't have signing authority on the trust anymore. She set it up so Megan is the sole trustee now that she's 30. Even if he figures it out, there's nothing he can do legally until after the money moves. By then, we'll be 2 countries away. Trevor laughed. He had a pleasant laugh. I had noticed that about him from the beginning. It was the laugh of a man who was comfortable, and I understood now what he was comfortable about. I stood in that hallway and felt something settle in my chest like cold water. Not rage. Exactly. Something quieter and more durable than rage. I sent a text to Gary. 2 floors up, please. Then I sent one to Megan. She appeared at the end of the hallway 90 seconds later, having told Trevor's mother she needed a moment of air. Her face was very still. I pointed at the door of room 214, held up one finger, and she nodded. We stood together outside that door. From inside, Trevor was talking about the timeline. Monday transfer, he said. Tuesday morning flight out of Vancouver, Renata said. She had found an arrangement in Portugal, apparently, that would accommodate the funds without difficulty. Megan's hand found mine. She held it very tightly. I did not look at her face because I did not want her to have to hold herself together for my benefit. She was doing that on her own already, and I was proud of her in a way that had nothing to do with the circumstances. When the voices paused, I knocked. There was a silence of about 4 seconds. Then the door opened, and Trevor stood there, and the sequence of expressions that crossed his face in the following 2 seconds told me more about who he actually was than 14 months of careful performance had managed to reveal. First, confusion, then recognition, then a rapid recalculation, and then the smile. He actually produced the smile. "Megan," he said, "what are you 2 doing up here?" Megan looked past him at Renata Voss, who was sitting at the small desk near the window, with a folder open in front of her. A legal-looking folder. "Who is this?" Megan's voice was entirely level. "This is Renata," Trevor said. "She's the consultant I mentioned, the one reviewing the venue paperwork." Megan looked at Trevor for a moment. Then she said, "I heard what you said about the trust." Trevor's smile did not disappear immediately. That is the thing about very practiced people. They can hold a position slightly longer than you expect. But it went eventually. From behind me in the hallway, I heard footsteps. Gary had arrived with 2 individuals I recognized from a meeting I had attended that afternoon at a nondescript office in downtown Penticton. Corporal Andrea Hewitt and her colleague from the RCMP's Commercial Fraud Unit, who had listened for 90 minutes to Gary's documentation and Helen Marsh's legal summary, and had agreed that what they were hearing constituted sufficient grounds for an active investigation and immediate intervention. I turned to Trevor. "I want you to understand something," I said. "I know your name is Trevor Halliday. I know about the lawsuit in Nova Scotia. I know about your former wife in Fredericton and her father's settlement. I know about the numbered company you share with Renata. I know what you plan to do with my daughter's inheritance, and so do the RCMP." His face had gone entirely still. Corporal Hewitt stepped forward and identified herself. She told both Trevor and Renata that they were being detained for questioning in connection with an investigation into alleged financial fraud. She was calm and professional, and she read them their rights in the particular flat way of someone who has done this many times before. Renata said something sharp about lawyers. Trevor said nothing at all. They were escorted from the room. The folder on the desk, which did indeed contain the trust modification documents with Megan's name already filled in on page 7, was photographed and taken as evidence. I stood in the doorway of that hotel room for a moment after they were gone. The lake was still visible through the window, fully dark now, a few lights from the far shore reflected on the water. Then I went back downstairs with my daughter. What happened next was not easy. Megan stood in front of 40 people in a private dining room overlooking a beautiful lake and told them, in fewer words than I would have managed, that the wedding was cancelled, that she was fine, and that she would appreciate their privacy and their support in the coming days. Some people cried. Some looked relieved in the way people do when something they suspected but could not say is finally acknowledged. Her brother Daniel sat with her for an hour afterward, and I was glad for that. I took a walk along the lake shore by myself around 10 o'clock. It was a cool night for early September, the kind that reminds you that summer's tenure in the Okanagan is always temporary. I thought about Patricia. I thought about the way she used to sit in the garden at the Kelowna property in the evenings with a glass of wine, very still, watching the light change over the hills. She had an instinct for stillness that I had never fully learned from her. I was still learning. The RCMP investigation moved forward over the following months. I won't detail all of it because some of it is still ongoing, but the core of what Gary and Helen had assembled held. Trevor Halliday and Renata Voss were formally charged in connection with the Moncton case and the Fredericton settlement, which investigators were able to reopen with new evidence, as well as the planned fraud against Megan. The former business partner in Nova Scotia, a man named Gerald, who had spent 7 years believing no one would ever take his complaint seriously, called me directly to say thank you. That call was unexpectedly hard to get through. Megan took 4 months to settle herself. She stayed in Vancouver but took a leave from work for 6 weeks, spent time with friends, drove up to Kelowna several weekends to sit in the garden with me and talk about nothing in particular or everything in particular, depending on the day. She cried, but not as often as I expected. She was angrier than she was sad, and I think that was the right proportion. The question she came back to most often was how she had missed it. "You didn't miss it," I told her, on one of those weekends in late November, sitting outside with the last of the fall sun on the dormant vineyard. "You felt it. You said 4 words to me at the party, because something in you already knew. The part of you that recognized it had just been up against 14 months of a very skilled performance." She was quiet for a moment. "He was good at it," she said. "He was. But you were better at listening to yourself than you gave yourself credit for." "I want to trust people again," she said. "I don't want to become someone who can't." "You won't." I poured more wine into her glass. "Your mother was one of the most trusting people I have ever known. Do you know why she could afford to be?" Megan shook her head. "Because she paid attention. Real trust isn't something you hand over freely and hope for the best. It's something you extend slowly, and you watch what a person does with the small amounts before you give them more. Your mother trusted people because she watched carefully first. That's not cynicism. That's just wisdom." Megan looked out at the vineyard for a long time. "Do you think she would have seen through him?" "In about a week," I said. "Maybe 10 days. She laughed for the first time in what felt like months, and I laughed too, and somewhere in the quality of that particular laugh I could hear Patricia very clearly. 6 months after the cancelled wedding, Megan called me on a Tuesday evening, which is not her usual calling day, which meant she had something to say that wouldn't wait for the weekend. She had been back at work for 4 months. She had started running again, something she had let go during the relationship. She had booked a trip to Portugal with Diane, which I thought showed admirable reclamation of something that had briefly been contaminated. And she had met someone, she said carefully, Not in a way that suggested anything serious yet, just in a way that suggested the possibility of something serious was no longer terrifying. "Tell me about him," I said. She did. She described him with a particular quality of attention, noticing specific things, the way he apologized to a waiter for taking too long to order, the way he talked about his family with ease and without editing himself, the way he had told her on their second meeting about a business venture that had failed badly and what he had learned from it. She was watching carefully. I could hear it in every sentence. "That's good," I told her. "Keep watching." "I know," she said. "I will." After we hung up, I walked out to the garden and stood where Patricia used to sit. The Okanagan in March is still cold, the vines stripped back and the hills a pale brown, nothing like the summer. But there is something in the quality of the light even then, a particular clarity that I have never found anywhere else. I thought about what it means to protect someone without diminishing them. You cannot watch over the people you love by standing between them and everything uncertain. Patricia understood that. The best protection I had been able to offer Megan was not a wall, but a set of tools. Pay attention to what doesn't add up. Trust the quiet voice that something is wrong. Ask for help before the situation is past helping, and understand that real love does not arrive fully formed and flawless. It arrives honestly, with its imperfections visible, and it stays when things are difficult. I thought about Gerald in Nova Scotia, who had filed a complaint for 7 years and finally been heard. I thought about the woman in Fredericton whose father had paid to make a problem disappear, which is a kind of protection that protects no one. I thought about the difference between those two responses and what it costs over time. I went inside, poured a small glass of something from one of the estate bottles Patricia had loved, and sat in her old chair. If you are a parent reading this, or a grandparent, or anyone who has someone they care about, moving toward a commitment they are not sure about, I want to say something plainly. Your instincts are information. The quiet feeling that something does not add up is worth investigating, not because you should treat everyone with suspicion, but because a brief and careful look costs very little compared to what it might prevent. You do not need to accuse anyone. You do not need to create conflict. You simply need to look and to make sure that the person you love has been given the truth before they make a permanent decision. The hardest part is not the investigation. The hardest part is trusting that the people you love can handle the truth. My daughter handled it with more grace than I had any right to expect. She had been carrying it herself for 3 weeks before she came to me, which tells you everything about the kind of person she is. Patricia chose well when she made me promise to pay attention. I am still learning to be worthy of that promise. But on the good days, I think I am getting there.